Dr. Charles Raison, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Well, it's good to have you on the show. You and your co-author, Vladimir Maletic, I hope I'm saying that correctly.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Well, the two of you have written the 2017 book, The New Mind-Body Science of Depression. I must say, it's a real tour de force on the topic of depression.
Thank you. It took us like 5 years to do it. So,
I can believe it.
Yeah,
it's a mighty work, I must say.
Yeah, it's hefty, isn't it?
Yeah. What led to the writing of this book?
Well, it's interesting. Vlad and I are colleagues, have been colleagues and friends for years. We do a lot of medical education stuff, a lot of lecturing to mental health people. Vlad is a walking encyclopedia of neurobiologic and clinical knowledge. So I have been in awe of him for years, and he and I worked together. And back about 6-7 years ago, we began to talk about the fact that we should try to get some of this stuff down in print. We were wandering around talking about it, and people seemed really, really interested. So we just decided, maybe foolishly, that we would undertake the idea of capturing this program of education that we've been doing for years and trying to put it in print form. And that's what really launched the book.
Wow. Well, I think it's a really important book. It seems like things are moving so fast in the field that it may not be a classic because the information will change.
Changes, I know. I mean, I've already thought about how if and when the time came that we did a second edition, it'd be a major rewrite. I mean,
wow.
From when we started the book to when we finished it, we had to go back and rewrite part of what we'd started because, times change. There's been a lot of interesting discovery in the last 4 or 5 years.
Well, I have to say your book is very carefully argued. It's evidence-based, and it presents a complex picture, which makes for challenging reading for the reader.
No, it's hard. Parts of it are very dense. One of the interesting things about the book is it kind of runs a gamut. Like we have some case studies in the back that are very approachable. Yep. Man, we've got some sections about the neurobiology that there's a lot in there. They're very dense and detailed.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna kind of lead you through much of the book,
sure.
And you can give us the highlights without having to drill down,
without going down into the depths. That's right. Save you from reading the book. Yeah, sure.
Your focus is on major depressive disorder, as opposed to what? There's major and there's
minor. There's all sorts. The manual of psychiatry, this thing called the DSM, that codifies diagnoses, has a number of mood disorders. Major depression, because it's the sort of standard depression. It's the flagship diagnosis of the depression world. But one of the key arguments we make in the book is that it's not, even though it has a code and we call it an illness, it's not a discrete thing. And in fact, in many places in the book, when you actually get into the text, at one point we explicitly say that we prefer to use the word depression because we recognize that depression far exceeds the more limited bounds of major depression, and that depression really, in almost all of its forms, of course, very, very painful. But can also just be very problematic for people. So actually, to tell you the truth, I've come to prefer the word depression better. It's not as clinical, it's not as exacting, but it gets closer to the fact that there is a phenomenon out there that is not one thing. It's more like a cloud of symptoms, but it's something that is very common. It tends to be typical. I mean, you see something like it all around the world. You can see it in hunter-gatherers. It's a thing. It's not a thing that has hard boundaries, but it is a thing, and it really is depression. And it's much closer, I think, actually, to what most of us understand as depression than some of these more exacting diagnoses.
I was really struck by what you just said, going back to hunters and gatherers, because you make the point that it's not a symptom of Western culture, which many people might assume, but it goes all the way back.
Yes, as far as we know. So we know in historical times that, there's a couple of ancient papyri from about 3000 BC from Egypt that articulate something that we would clearly recognize as major depression. Mood disorders were beautifully described in the ancient world. Hippocrates did a good job. There were others. I'm blocking on the guy's name. It wasn't Galen. There's a famous guy from Turkey. His name will come to me later. That laid out mood disorders beautifully and recognized bipolar disorder, which is a type of mood disorder. Beautiful descriptions of depression in the Renaissance, right? But more recently, there's been some interesting work. In fact, part of it was done to test one of the theories that we talk about in the book, having to do with why depression may have evolved. A group of anthropologists out of the University of New Mexico went down to one of the last they're not fully hunter-gatherers, but they're pretty close to that, and did very, very rigorous depression screening there, and it found a number of interesting things. One of them was that the biology of depression there looks like the biology of depression here, and second, that the symptoms look the same. Right, that people had very much the same symptoms, and they had the symptoms for many of the same reasons. Right, there's a little cadre of reasons for why humans tend to get depressed, and I think the best evidence suggests that those reasons are very ancient, and depression evolved probably as a response in one way or other for coping with those reasons.
Yeah, well, we will get into that, I'm
Yeah.
sure, as we move along here. I was also surprised to learn that individuals who have experienced more than one major depression show lasting cognitive decline. I wasn't aware of that. That's rather alarming.
Very alarming. I mean, for those of us that have, many of us have struggled with depression, and
I have.
I have too. I mean, it's a real bummer. So, if you've had a depression, if you think about it, you probably recognize that it impairs your thinking. It makes you feel sluggish. You have a hard time remembering things. And then there's this indecisive thing that comes up, but we don't sometimes think of that as cognitive, but you have a hard time making decisions. Things seem overwhelming that way. And there's older data actually that those symptoms they take longer to clear up than sort of the mood symptoms do. They're not always as responsive to antidepressants. They linger. And they are a major source of morbidity in the disorder. Really part of what nails people with depression is it screws up their ability to think and remember. So it's a huge problem, and it's a problem that we're becoming more aware of in the last few years. Certainly it's become of more interest since we started writing the book, because it's become a focus of the pharmaceutical industry. There are a couple of new antidepressants that target a serotonin receptor that has been associated with improved cognition. So all of a sudden people are very interested in this idea that, oh man, maybe we can specifically do something about it. Not so clear that's true, but anyway, it's a big deal.
Yeah, one of the things that you take on is the DSM-V, which has some coverage of depression. What is it that they've got wrong there?
Well, what they've got wrong. So they've got a couple of things wrong, but they've got a couple of things right. And so one of the things that's complex in the book is that, in fact, we didn't land on the side of tossing out this DSM or the DSM-5. What they have wrong is that it's built upon an idea that is extremely admirable, and that was the idea of one of my main mentors. So I went to school at a place called Washington University in St. Louis, and that was really one of the two primary founding sites for what became the DSM. And this guy, he was the chairman of the department, Samuel Guzet, along with Eli Robbins, felt and provided some evidence that psychiatric conditions were really diseases, and that if you looked at their symptoms, and if you followed their symptoms over time, that it would be like discovering a bacteria and saying, oh, yeah, hey, that's what causes tuberculosis. That you could really get at the idea that these were diseases. And so they thought that something like major depression was a disease state, and that it was a disease state that differed, say, from something like bipolar disorder, or different from something like schizophrenia. Why did it differ? Because it had different symptoms and it tended to have different outcome over time. It's not that that's exactly wrong, but it's pretty clear now that it's really not true. That, in fact, as we've come to understand the mechanisms for these disorders, both genetic and sort of systems within the body, there's a huge overlap between many of these disorders. So, for instance, the genetic risk factors for depression are largely shared with something like bipolar disorder and even with schizophrenia. When you look at the mechanisms that underlie these disorders, there's some evidence that there's some differences between them. But what strikes me is the fact that so many of the changes are sort of reminiscent of each other. So if you look at brain changes or immune changes, So what's emerged now in psychiatry is that in ways we never would have guessed 30, 40 years ago, these disorders that we label as being separate have powerful genetic and biological overlaps. And we don't know how to cleave nature at the joints. What we don't know how to do, though, is to take these emerging scientific data and say, oh, well, let's come up with a whole bunch of new disorders. There's two people with depression. They got the same symptoms. One of them has a problem with their immune system. And so, they've got a TNF, that's an immune molecule. They've got a TNF disorder. So, hey, we used to call it major depression. Now we call it TNF disease. This other person, they've got a problem with their cortisol. So we're not going to call it major depression anymore. We're going to call it cortisol disorder. That's what we cannot do, right? So even though we've begun to understand that there are complex overlaps in the biology of these disorders and within each disorder, we have not yet come up with anything, frankly, I think better than the DSM. And that's why in the book, I think what we said, and this eventually is what I think the National Institute of Mental Health has recently decided too. What's important is to recognize that the DSM, with its description of things like major depression, is a useful clinical document that helps people use the same language. So you and I can kind of diagnose the same thing if we see somebody with something like major depression, but that these are not disorders like rheumatoid arthritis or pneumococcal pneumonia, because we don't understand their causes that way. And so the diseases of the DSM are clinically useful suggestions. They're not God's truth.
Yeah, in fact, you talk about the National Institutes of Mental Health, NIMH, in the book, and you say that for the purpose of funding research, they're sort of ignoring the DSM-5 and requiring a different type of research. Yes. Can you briefly characterize what that different type of research is?
So another colleague of mine, a very famous guy named Tom Insel, became the head of NIMH. He's no longer there, but for about 15 years ago. Brilliant, bold, controversial man. And he came in and he said, when we look at mental health research, when we look at research in general, if we look at cancer, we see a significant decline in deaths from cancer over the last 20 years. If we look at heart disease, even more impressive. We look at, say, depression, let's say suicide as a proxy for depression. Rates haven't dropped, they've gone up. We are failing, and more recently he said, I spent, I don't know what the number was, like $20 billion during my tenure at NIMH. We did some really cool stuff and I don't think we accomplished anything. So he decided to take the bull by the horns and say, he thought part of the problem was that we're trying to study these DSM disorders and they don't exist. They don't exist that way. They don't have a single mechanism. So they came up with a system called RDoc, which stands for something I can't remember. But basically, instead of reaching into the DSM, they said, we're going to have these domains that we think characterize mental disturbance more generally. So a cognitive function domain, a stress resilience domain, a negative affect valence domain. And we're going to want, you're only going to get grants if they propose to study those domains. Now, of course, the problem with that is that those domains also do not really cleave nature to joints. And maybe they're better, but you can see you're now setting up another set of these sort of criteria. So if you take something like stress resilience, there are probably 100 ways to get stress resilience, right? So calling that a sort of a mechanism, it's a step forward, but the problem is we don't know the 100 ways. It's just, the brain and the body in these regards are so complex that although we've learned a lot, really trying to zero in, that's always the problem. But yes, NIMH has really changed things in very interesting ways in terms of they will now really only fund projects that use these sort of criteria and try to look at a mechanism. So if I got a new treatment for depression, they're not very interested in me just trying to depress people. What they want is for me to say, I think it works by blocking inflammation. So first show me that it blocks inflammation, and then show me that the more it does that, the more undepressed people get. It's a very logical idea, right? They're really trying to get to be like the rest of the medicine and world of medicine and try to find mechanisms.
Yeah. You write that we need a new phenomenology of depression. What are you getting at there?
Yeah.
Well, I think of phenomenology as the experience, the inside experience. depression.
Yes. Also here, it's often used in this realm also to mean like a descriptor of symptoms, like a description of what is it that people that have depression experience.
Uh-huh.
Um, and there is no doubt that we need that. And there's no doubt that I have no idea what it is.
Oh,
I mean, honestly, I mean, we all have some ideas, but this is the huge challenge is, so it sort of depends how you look at it, actually. And this is one of the things the book says too, right? So if you try to go in up close and really, really hone in on details, it's sort of like a Buddhist view of the world where, you know, when you try to find solid objects, things just sort of vanish into these sort of complex interrelationships. If you try to be very specific about the phenomenology of something like depression, you cannot figure out where it starts, where it ends, what is what. But one of the things that I realized in writing this book, and Vlad and I realized, was that if you step way back, you actually can get a sense of the phenomenology of depression. So we can say certain things about it. We've already said some of them. One is that it's remarkably common. Two is that it doesn't really tend to come out of the blue. Most of the time, it is in response to certain types of environmental adversities. It tends to hit men and women at different ages. In general, it tends to have a set of symptoms. Not everybody has all the symptoms. But so if you go back, that turns out to be quite useful, actually.
mhm.
And it's different than a simpler just sort of, oh, it's a medical illness and it's got a code. Because if you look at it this way, it has a narrative, right? So it turns out that it has causes. And it has effects too, but it has causes. And one of the arguments in the book is that the causes of depression are fairly stereotyped, suggesting that they're ancient in human evolution and they're not random. And so
Yeah.
that gives you a sense that, wow, you know, yeah, we can call it a disease. If pragmatically, it might as well be a disease. It wrecks lives, but it's not just a disease. It actually turns out to be an evolved response to adversity. And that opens some really interesting doors for thinking about it and for thinking about its phenomenology.
Yeah. So you mentioned bipolar, and I was wondering, where does that fit in? Does that complicate the picture?
Mm-hmm. It does. It does. Right. It does.
Like, is it
So,
more of its own
yeah.
thing, or
Oh, yeah.
part of its
Well,
own thing, or?
so in the old days, in the way old days, people were kind of lumpers. They thought everything ran together. There are modern people that think that all disorders of mood are bipolar. Most of us don't believe that, but I admire that position. I don't agree with it fully, but I really admire it. It's an ancient, it goes back to the ancient world, to that guy whose name I'm not thinking of from Turkey. Uh, but more recently, and certainly in the DSM, there was this sharp distinction. Unipolar disorders, just depression is one thing. Bipolar disorder is something else. That's not true. We know that's not true. They're clearly not the same thing, right? Because, you know, to have bipolar disorder, you have to have a manic episode or a hypomanic episode. And those can take various flavors. But when they're extreme, you know, people are psychotic, they're hearing voices, they don't sleep, they can't stop talking, they're all the time, right? And that, it looks like the opposite of depression. So clearly it's not the same thing as depression, but bizarrely, it's not altogether different either. Many of the biologic changes you see in mania, you can see in depression. It's weird. And many people that seem to have depression, especially when it's recurrent, when it happens to somebody a lot over the years, many of those people will eventually have something like a manic episode. So we are just, the field, as we've learned more, we've understood less in some ways. And that's one of the ways we've understood less. The clear demarcation of just regular old depression from bipolar disorder has softened a little bit. Now, I'll tell you one way I think about the distinction is that depression tends to be a response to certain types of adversity, largely social and often immune, infectious related adversity. Bipolar disorder is often a response to the adversity of time. Most of us don't think of time as an adversity, but it is. It's quite an adversity, actually.
Getting older?
No, not that. Getting up every day, going through the day, going to sleep. The literal passage of circadian rhythms is a
Ah,
powerful stressor, right? So the most stressful thing you do most days that aren't terrible is get up in the morning, and your body prepares for it for a couple of hours. It activates the stress system. That's why there's a surfeit of death right at dawn. The reason people die at dawn is because it's really rough to get up. Ask any teenager, they know that, but it turns out to
yeah,
be true.
I
Yeah,
was thinking of
right.
teenagers.
So, but most of us manage that. Bipolar disorder, one of the classic things that induces episodes of bipolar disorder is disruption of circadian functioning. So missing sleep, right? So for people with real bipolar disorder, all you gotta do is keep them up for a night and they'll frequently go fully manic. If you put them to sleep for 12 hours, I used to do a lot of clinical work. I do more research now, but in the day I ran a large inpatient service in California. And several times we took people that were, doing things like running around naked in public, screaming and stuff like that, put them to sleep for 12 hours. And literally twice the people woke up the next morning and said, oh my God, where am I? What happened? And they were perfectly normal, right? So, all sorts of manic people have breaks when they get on a plane and fly to Europe, So there's a similarity there that bipolar disorder, it tends to be more free cycling. It's more of a brain disorder. It's when it's really severe, it really looks like there's something wrong with people's brains. But it's not just that. We also know that the episodes of bipolar disorder are sparked by the environment, but they're also sparked by the stress of time and circadian time in a way that depression, regular old depression, is not.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that you emphasize in the book is that depression is not a unitary disorder, and that there's a complex interaction between genetics and environment.
Correct.
And it's not all one or all the other.
That's right. Yes, that's right. That's right. So, that's not novel. I think the whole field recognizes that psychiatric disorders arise at the interface of genetic vulnerability and environmental conditions. And the conditions that produce depression are often conditions of adversity, right? So it's a continuum model. And a simple way to think about it is that there are some people who their essential makeup, which we think is largely driven by genes and the way those genes are expressed through epigenetic changes. There are some people that take a lot of grief to get unhappy and get depressed, right? And so there may be, but there's a famous story from ancient Athens about a king who had everything until the end of his life, when he lost his wife, he lost his children, he lost his kingdom, and on his deathbed he said, "Call no man happy until he dies," meaning that there are things that can happen that can probably upset everybody, but some people need a lot of push from the environment. Other people are genetically vulnerable. They're more sensitive to environmental perturbations. They need much less push for the environment. And because life is difficult, as the Buddha said, all life is suffering. You are going to suffer in life. The more you're vulnerable to that, the more likely you are to get depressed, because the world is just not, it's not a bowl of cherries, right? Most of us fall somewhere in the middle. So, but that's a way of thinking about that continuum where the genes and the environment talk to each other that way. But then, one of the things we do in the book that's really interesting is we raise the point that, the idea, even the dichotomy of genes and environment is in many ways false, because, if you think about what a gene is, it's a chemical structure, but it's really an encoding of information. And if you say, well, what's that information? It really isn't encoding. It's information about past environments, right? Because those genes are there mostly, not always, but mostly because they were selected by past environments. So, from a gene's point of view, everything outside the gene is environment, right? So if you're a gene and you're wanting to survive and reproduce, your body is outside environment, right? If you're a human, then there's a lot more on the inside. You think your guts are on the inside and your genes are on the inside, and the environment starts with your skin. But there, it really turns out that there's another continuum, which is that genes and environments they're also married to each other, and they're ciphers for each other. So, one element's environment is another element's gene, right? So you think about an individual gene, right? Its environment includes the chromosome. It includes the entire genome, because it's fighting with those other genes. They get along, but they also fight. And then if you look at a chromosome, well, its environment is the cell. You look at the cell, its environment is the body. And so when you really get into it, you begin to realize that although it's very difficult to model these things, what really is going on is that all these levels are in constant interaction with each other, and the interactions are largely bidirectional. So you get these extreme complex systems. And when you get complex systems, it's why we can't accurately forecast the weather. They become so complex that actually finding what they're doing becomes either intractable, meaning you don't have enough computer power to do it, or nearly impossible. That's one of the challenges, right, for thinking about why depression is so difficult. But the simplest thing to say, and what I started with, is we know that genes and environments interact with each other.
Yeah. And so we're talking about multiple causal pathways.
Multiple causal pathways that are also interacting with each other in ascending levels, right? So you get 12 pathways, and there's some number that's huge for how many different ways 12 pathways can interact with each other. Then those interactions can interact with each other. And some levels are going to be much more important for intervention than others, right? So that's how we can do anything in life. But still, it's like in this way, it's like a quantum understanding that it's like a cloud of causes, and some of them are more important than others, but it's very complicated. And in
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
circumstances, a cause that wasn't so relevant in another circumstance becomes very important, and that's another complication. So I
Yeah.
think one of the things writing the book did for me, Dave, was really make me realize a certain humility that wow, we're learning a lot. Uh, what I'm saying to you now wouldn't have been said 20 years ago. So even the articulation of our ignorance has become more knowing. But it's a very humbling thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another eye opener for me was, and it really relates to what you've been saying about systems within systems and everything being
Yeah.
connected, is that there's a high degree of comorbidity among individuals with major depression, as well as among their families.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So these things certainly run in families. There's no doubt about that. And that is a strong argument that there is a genetic underpinning. Now, me and one of my other close buddies argue about this constantly. He's a total genetic guy. I'm much more of an environmental guy. But we know there's something genetic, even though finding a single gene for depression has proved thus far impossible. But we know there's something genetic. But then other things get passed down in families, right? So environment gets passed down in families. And now we know from animal studies that, in fact, how your genes are expressed can get passed down through the generations, right? That the experiences of one generation get encoded in the epigenetic sort of markings of the next generation. So it runs in families for both genetic and environmental reasons. And then these psychiatric disorders run together. They're also a family, right? So many people with major depression will have other psychiatric conditions, often anxiety disorders. Most people that are really depressed are going to be anxious as hell too, right? But most people that have chronic anxiety will eventually get depressed. Right? So you see this bi-directional thing that people that have other significant psychiatric conditions will usually end up with a depression at the end of the day. And the explanation we'd offer from the book's perspective is that these disorders are terrible stressors, right? And so they're fertile seed grounds for the development of depression. But then depression makes people, the big risk for other disorders, right? So we know, for instance, that depression is a risk factor for substance abuse. But more disturbingly, and I hate to say it, but we know that depression over time is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, a huge risk factor. It's a risk factor for diabetes. It's a risk factor for dementia. All these things are increased in people that have depression, right? So it's comorbid with all sorts of things, and all sorts of things cause it, and it contributes to the cause of all sorts of things.
Yeah. Wow. That was kind of an eye opener to realize that these things go in such clusters and a grim outlook, actually.
Sadly,
you talk,
it's hard.
you talk about a loss of evolutionary fitness resulting from environmental adversity. What's that?
What's that about? Well, okay. So a fair proportion of the book tries to address potential evolutionary understandings for why depression exists. So there's a riddle, and the riddle is this. Even though we haven't found a gene for depression, and even though we know there's environmental contributions that are huge, there's a lot of evidence that there's genetic underpinnings to this disorder, right? So you've got genes that set you up for depression. Depression seems to be so inimical to optimal functioning, certainly in the modern world. But now again, from hunter-gatherers, the depressed people, they're not going out there in some other world and really benefiting, apparently, because they're depressed. They often commit suicide. Depression strike. It's partly genetic. It really looks to be inimical, bad for survival and reproduction. It strikes people early in life, especially women, right in the middle of the years when the Darwinian burden of survival and reproduction is maximal. why hasn't it been culled? Why hasn't it been removed from the human genome by adaptive forces, by natural selection? And we kind of propose two answers to those questions, one more direct and the other less direct. And the less direct answer is what addresses your question, right? So one of the things that we noticed over the years was that there's an odd thing about the types of adversity that make people depressed. They're largely social and they're largely immunological, by which I mean, if you made a list of what makes people depressed around the world, one of them is being sick. If you say, well, what's being sick about? Well, it's partly a stressor, but most illnesses are also a manifestation of activation of the immune system, something called inflammation. And we and others have shown in many studies that if you take people that are not inflamed and begin to inflame them through something like a medicine that activates the immune system, they have a huge rate of getting depressed. They get major depression, they get minor depression. Inflammation makes people depressed. And sickness.
Let me just cut in with a personal experience here. Often I can tell that I'm getting sick because I'll start to get depressed.
Me too.
I'll start to have kind of depressive thoughts or something.
Yeah.
And then it turns out I'm getting a cold.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people, and I've had this experience, can actually have bizarre, joyous, kind of hyper mood states getting sick too, which again points to the fact that very high mood, very low mood are driven by, kind of underlying similarities. But right, you're right. It's absolutely true. We know it's true. It's been shown in studies, right? So you're right. That's exactly right. So we begin to wonder, why is it that getting sick makes you depressed? And why is it that certain types of social things make you depressed? What are those things? They have a lot to do with losing status, being shamed, losing options, losing valuable loved one, losing resources, being trapped in situations that are horrible for you emotionally, but ones that you can't escape. Why are these things so depressogenic? Why are they so unreasonably depressogenic, right? And the answer we suggest in the book is that, in fact, although nowadays many of these things are not at all risks to survival or reproduction, they really were across most of human evolution, right? So here's a thought experiment that I sometimes give in lectures, right? I suggest that the things that make people depressed are the things that reliably signaled that you as an individual were in danger of not optimally surviving and reproducing. That's not consciously why you're upset. But evolution's tricky. It likes to take things, proximal causes, and use them for ends that we don't necessarily want to do. The classic example is sex, right? Evolution uses the pleasure of sex to get people to procreate. Evolution uses our sense of needing to be important, of needing to be more important than other people, our need not to be shamed. Evolution uses all these things to drive certain types of behavior that were adaptive across human evolution, given the kind of creatures that humans are, right? So what we've suggested is that the things that make us depressed today were things that signaled to us in the old days, like back, before modern times, signaled in hunter-gatherer times that you were at risk of dying or not reproducing. So take an example, right? So think about, if depression was really about survival and reproduction in the modern world, every time you see a car go by, you should become utterly despondent, because especially early in life, cars are a major source of killing you so that you don't survive and reproduce. And yet none of us feel that way. And yet many of us, when we got on an airplane, are terrified, even though your odds of dying on any one flight are something like 20 million to 1, right? Why are we terrified? Because people have been dying from falling for heights across all of hominid evolution. We have an evolved fear of heights. It's unreasonable, but it's emotionally powerful. The things that make us depressed in the modern world are like fear of heights. You become depressed because you lose status in front of a boss, or, you're fighting with a coworker. Now, what the modern world lets you do is get another boss, quit often. You often have other options. You're not usually going to die. Your children aren't usually going to die. But if you look at foraging hunter-gatherer societies, if you fall in status, especially if you become ostracized, you will die. Ostracized people died. Children whose parents died or were excluded from the group were often killed, or much more likely to die. There's really nice anthropologic data on this. So the idea is that one of depression's purposes from an evolutionary point of view is as a signaling mechanism. It signals that you are in danger. You're in evolutionary danger, and evolution gets your attention by making you feel horrible. You feel like you're in personal danger, right? That was literally true 100,000 years ago. It's not literally true now. And that's the way in which depression is an evolutionary mismatch. One of the ways we
Yeah.
can treat, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking it's unconscious, but
Mm-hmm.
but deeper than in the Freudian sense. It's
Yes, it's more Jungian. It's more Jungian this way. It's like a collective unconscious, except it's wired
yeah,
in biological mechanisms, social mechanisms, and genes, right? What it means, though, treatment-wise, is that part of what we need to face when we treat depression is to recognize that the things that we're in a lucky moment, right? That the things that are making us depressed are actually probably most of the time not going to kill us, that they're often, in fact, far more minor in the real world for many of us in the modern world than they were in the world of our ancestors. I find this very helpful personally, right? To think about, I'm just so bummed out that I did a presentation on the job and it wasn't really that well received. Well, yes, it does matter. I mean, you may end up not living in a giant mansion, but there's other things that matter more, and recognizing that these thoughts don't line up so well with reality in the modern world, especially, that forms the basis of meditation. It forms the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. So this provides an evolutionary underpinning to some of these treatments of just recognizing that we are burdened with an ancient physiology and an ancient psychology. And we're burdened, but there's also some great opportunities. Some of the positives we need to recover in the modern world, but the negative is, we're walking around. Faulkner said, the past isn't dead. The past isn't even the past. And that is the truth when it comes to to both the biology and the psychology of depression. And that's one way in which evolution, and that's to that thing about evolution being a signaling thing, that we are at risk, that our evolutionary fitness is at risk.
yeah. You mentioned inflammation earlier, and that was one of the really intriguing things for me in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm reading in various places in the newspaper and so on things about inflammation and trying to get that we all are carrying a certain amount of inflammation in our bodies,
Mm-hmm.
which sounds alarming. And so chronic inflammation tends to cause depression
Mm-hmm.
because the brain detects the threat. Do I have
Mm-hmm.
that right?
You got it. That's it. That's it. That's our little contribution to the world of brain immune stuff. That's right. That's the argument of the book. This is where things tie together. Right. What inflammation tells a person is, hey, guess what? You're going to die, right? You've been infected, or you have a cancer, or you've had massive tissue trauma, right? So if you say, what are the things that activate inflammation? Well, they're all things that increase, that it's a signal that something is happened or is happening that's about to increase your risk of dying. And of course, from an evolutionary perspective, dying, especially before your children are secure in their lineage, dying is a big, bad way to end your Darwinian mandate, right? So evolution is a sort of subtle signal that you are in trouble in that regard, and it makes people depressed, right? And there's some really interesting evidence that this is the case. There's some evidence that inflammation is more likely to make people depressed when they're younger, which makes sense because that signal that you're going to die is of more evolutionary relevance when you're younger in terms of survival and reproduction. The other interesting thing is we did a study a number of years ago. So really my mentor, a guy named Andrew Miller, is one of the great fathers of this field. And he trained me up. I owe much of my thought to him. But together we did a number of studies where we showed that indeed, if you looked at people who were getting inflamed because they were taking a drug called interferon, which activates inflammation, these folks get depressed. If inflammation makes you depressed, you should be able to treat depression by blocking inflammation. So we set out to put our money where our mouth was and to prove this. And so we did a study where we took people that were healthy but depressed, very depressed. They'd failed a couple of antidepressants. And we gave them a very powerful anti-inflammatory. It's something called Infliximab. It used to be marketed as Remicade. You see these ads on TV for psoriasis and things like this. These are really interesting drugs because they don't do anything but block inflammatory molecules. So Infliximab has no other effects on the body, this drug we used, other than to take out the most potent inflammatory molecule, a thing called tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF. So there's no other side effects that could explain its effects. If it works, all it's done is kill inflammation, right? So we did the study. We compared it to placebo, just salt water. We saw that a lot of people were getting better. We figured we were going to get rich and famous. When the study was over, we looked, and placebo worked a little better than the drug. Blocking inflammation in depressed folks in general did not work. In fact, salt water was a better antidepressant in these people. It was quite striking. But when we looked, we had another idea that we tested, which was we thought that if inflammation is making you depressed, the people who have higher inflammation should get a better response from having it blocked. That was absolutely true. It was astoundingly true. It was a straight line. If you were depressed and you had high inflammation, Infliximab worked better than placebo. It looked like an antidepressant. If you had low inflammation and you were just as depressed, the placebo worked much better. There's a whole story there we don't understand. But for today, the thing that's interesting is Infliximab is too big to get into the brain. It works in the body. So what does this mean? It suggests that you take people who are depressed and you assume that their brains must be abnormal because the brain is creating their consciousness. You treat them with a drug that doesn't get into the brain. What does it do? It turns off that signal of danger from the body. When that happens, people start feeling better. How is that possible? What I've argued is the only way it's possible is that the brain is no longer getting that signal. And so the brain, you see these abnormalities, quote unquote, in depression and how the brain's functioning. Maybe they're abnormalities or maybe they're fairly reasonable responses to a signal that you're going to die. Of course, the abnormalities in the brain, the brain patterns are producing the depressed emotions and thoughts. But you turn off the signal from the body and the brain all of a sudden goes, wow, shoot, kind of a beautiful cloud there. I don't feel so bad, right? It's amazing, right? It's so sure. In a way, the brain is the proximal cause of depression. But if you can turn it off by turning off a body signal, you could say, well, no, it's actually the signal from the body, right? So this really highlights the fact that you're exactly right, that we suggest that inflammation makes people depressed because it's a signal. Now, that's not the only reason inflammation makes people depressed, though. We think that the other thing is that it actually serves an adaptive purpose. Depression looks a lot like sickness. If you make a list of what happens to you when you're sick and what happens to you when you're depressed, in fact, many of the symptoms overlap, including weird things like changes in iron and changes in zinc and things like this that don't seem to serve any social function for human beings, right? I mean, why, if depression has to do with managing, the scary boss of the tribe, why would your zinc drop? But it turns out that when you look and you ask another question, which is, why does sickness exist? I mean, who wants to be sick? The answer is sickness is an evolved response to pathogen danger. The reason we get sick is because the symptoms of sickness help us survive. Why do you get a fever? You get a fever because higher body temperatures ramp up the immune system and they make bugs fall apart. Bugs don't do very well at higher temperatures. You can make a list of all the symptoms of sickness, and many of them have that function. Well, it turns out depression has almost all the symptoms of sickness. So, for instance, we think, well, fever is really a classic symptom of sickness. Fever is a classic symptom of depression. Depressed people, on average, in many studies actually, run their body temperature a couple of degrees higher. You treat them and their body temperature drops, right? You could make a list. Depressed people have changes in zinc. Depressed people have changes in iron. So we begin to realize that depression looked like what's called an acute phase response to infection. And then when we began to look, we realized, holy moly, the genes that have been most implicated in depression, if you look at the form of the gene that's associated with depression, you can almost always find evidence that it helps people survive one or another very serious infection, suggesting that, in fact, the types of genes and the types of immunologic processes that seem to promote depression seem to also promote pathogen defense against infection. And so we and others have elaborated something that we call the pathogen host theory of depression, or pathos D, which just basically says that one of the reasons that depression evolved in part to help us manage our relationships, but not so much manage our relationships with other people, manage our relationships with the microbial world. And from that perspective, in eras before modernity, when 50% of everybody who was born died of infection by age 15, and when babies had nothing but these inflammatory processes between themselves and death for the first 2 years of life, anything that selected for an inflammatory bias in our genome would likely be selected, because whatever the costs of inflammation are, if you're going to die when you're a kid, if this keeps you alive, even marginally, the selective benefit over time is huge. And that this is why you see this suite of behaviors and genetic and genes in human beings that have this inflammatory bias. And that inflammatory bias, there is a risk factor for depression. And that explains why depression, in part, why depression persists.
Because it was adaptive.
Yeah, because it was adaptive. That's right. That's right. And so, we talked about those foragers down in Bolivia that turned out to have the same type of depression that we do. They went down there to see if they had the same types of inflammatory changes, and they do. And they did an interesting thing where they showed that the depressed people had a better immunologic response to certain, they pulled their blood and put it in a test tube, and they had a better response to certain pathogens that are relevant down there, right? So it's kind of a beautiful story. And there's one more twist to this story, which is the inflammatory. So we think that the link between inflammation and depression is ancient, that it's an evolved adaptive strategy. We also think, however, that it's been made hyper acute in the modern world because it's been unmasked by the loss of something else, which is our connection with other types of microorganisms that we and others have called the old friend microorganisms, but many, many environmental organisms that used to be common in the human world that we've removed because of sanitation and changes and all sorts of things. Many of these microbes had very powerful anti-inflammatory properties. So across most of human evolution, you had this inflammatory bias that was being pushed by the selective advantage of inflammation helping you survive infection, but it was held in check by the fact that you as a human being swam in a environmental world of microbial organisms that, because they didn't want to be destroyed by the immune system, over time taught the immune system to be tolerant. It's sort of like a brake on the immune system that we began to lose as human beings in the late 1700s, actually. So all of a sudden things start getting clean in Western Europe, and there's an explosion of hay fever and these sort of asthmatic things. And we've been off to the races ever since because we and others think that we've lost this moderating influence of these other types of microorganisms. So the link between inflammation and depression is ancient, but it's exacerbated by the modern world.
Wow. Wow, that's fascinating. Now, another thing that we read a lot about these days is the biome. It sounds like that would play in there somewhere. Oh,
huge, right? So there have been these really interesting studies in the last few years. So the microbiome, just for folks that don't know. So 10 years ago, we thought of ourselves as discrete entities, sort of human beings. The cells in our bodies are mammalian cells. We now know that it's equally valid to look at each of us as actually a community or a universe. And in fact, if you counted up the total number of cells in your body, only 1 out of 10 are human. The rest are mostly bacterial, but there's also fungi and parasites. But about 90% of the cells in your body are bacterial. If you look at the DNA in our body, only 1% of the DNA in our body is human. 99% is bacterial. Mostly, right? So we're each of us is a community. We're a compromise between the cells of our own body with their DNA and the cells of these little other creatures that live within us, that are with us but not of us. And our behavior, we increasingly think, is sort of a compromise of that. Now, the vast bulk of these microbial organisms, to the tune of trillions and trillions, live within our guts. It's been said that the most complex ecosystem known in the universe is the gut. But there's also huge numbers of cells of bacterial and viral and fungi cells in the lungs, on the skin. Anywhere where the human meets the world, there is this powerful community of microbial species that we call the microbiome. That's what the microbiome is. So it turns out that the microbiome of modern humans is profoundly different than the microbiome of the last hunter-gatherers. This has been done in a tribe in Africa called the Hadza, and their microbiome is just remarkably different. Western folks go live with them for a few days, and they already begin to look more like the Hadza. It's interesting. So it's not something genetic. It has to do with the way they live their life. But that microbiome that is so abnormal in the modern world is almost certainly contributing to a whole bunch of modern problems: allergies, asthma, autoimmune conditions, all these immunologic conditions that are running rampant in the modern world. Now that's interesting, but what's more interesting is that it hadn't been shown so clearly in humans yet at all, although it's beginning to. But in animals, you can take something like a mouse or a rat, and if you clear out all those bacteria in its gut and put in new ones, you can totally change its behavior depending on where you took the fecal matter from, right? So there's two classic studies. One is they had a strain of very anxious, timid mice and a strain of very bold, exploratory mice. They cleaned out their guts, but they collected, poop, feces from both those species and swapped them. When they did that, the mice that had been timid became very brave. The mice that had been brave became very timid. And if you said what happened when you did that fecal transplant, the mice that got the brave fecal matter had changes in their brain that you see when you give somebody, or if you give a mouse, an antidepressant. The bugs in the gut, they look around and they say, all right, hey, we want to survive, so we need to change. We don't want to be in this nervous little mouse here. And so they begin talking to the brain and they change the way the brain functions. There's a study in mice showing that if you take mice that don't have a microbiome, so they've got completely clean guts, and you give half of them fecal matter from depressed humans and half of them fecal matter from normal humans, the mice that get the depressed human poop start acting depressed. Right. Recently,
Wow.
Well, there's a small study recently which is published in autistic kids. Right, not very large, about 20, but these were severely autistic adolescents mostly. They didn't do anything to their brains. They just cleaned out their guts and gave them a fecal matter transplant. They collected, feces from normal humans and transplanted it into the guts of these autistic kids. So their guts began looking more like normal people, and they had a significant improvement in their autistic symptoms. Now, I'd be less inclined to believe this, but there's evidence now that you can do bone marrow transplant for autism, right? You shield the head, you don't do anything to the head, you irradiate the body, you kill all the immune cells, and then you transplant normal ones, and the kids have a huge improvement in their autism. In animal models, bone marrow transplant can totally change the behavior of an animal. We think, so in other words, what we know is that the immune system is a second brain. And we know that it's a second brain that is a messenger system back and forth between us and them, and that we are compromised between us and them. What we call, what I call me is part me and partly the bugs.
Amazing.
Yeah, I did amazing.
Let me have you change the tilt on your screen or pull back a little, because we're getting a lot of
glare.
Your chin missing.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No,
chin.
Chin.
So, otherwise, is that better?
No, that's going the wrong way.
This way?
There. Yeah, about like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Your passion was just causing you to get
I was kind of leaning forward. Yeah.
Yeah. And wow, so fascinating. So, has there been a fecal implant study relating to depression in human beings?
I wanted to do that starting about 10 years ago. People thought I was out of my mind. I mean, really, I got looks that,
can imagine.
I decided I had to watch it. I could damage my career. No, not that I know of, but it's begging to be done. It's just.
It seems like an obvious next step from what you said.
It is. It breaks my heart that I won't be the one to do it. You can't just waltz into this stuff. Somebody's doing it now. It's such a clear thing to do. I'm in contact with folks that do fecal transplants medicinally down in Mexico, where it's legal. And, it's all anecdotal data, but many people that come in with things like bad allergies or autoimmune conditions seem to have a big emotional response, feel better. So, right. Now, we're even more interested, actually, not in things that are residents of the gut. We're actually more interested in microorganisms that really come from the environment, but that used to pass through us all the time and that are now gone, right? So, So there's one in particular that has been a long fascination of my colleagues and I, something called Mycobacterium vaccae, which has been in development. It and related species have been in development now for a number of years as treatments for cancer in the UK and Britain. And there's some very striking studies that when you add this to chemotherapy, you get a huge improvement in survival. I mean, it's quite striking. In animal models, if you take you kill the microorganism, you just take its chemicals. If you inject it into the tail, say, of a mouse or a rat, it works as an antidepressant. It's quite remarkable. And in humans that had cancer and got it, there's some pretty interesting data that it actually has some pretty powerful mood-enhancing effects. So we don't just think it's things like probiotics and fecal matter transplants that may hold promise here, but in fact, some of these species that were once rampant in the environment that are now missing, that have very powerful immune moderating effects, may even have more promise as antidepressant strategies.
Wow, really fascinating.
Yeah.
So now we're kind of into the realm of therapy. And one of the things that you talked about was WBH, whole body
Hypothermia.
hypothermia.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, okay. So one of the things that I recognized a few years ago is that in pursuing this link between the mind and the body, and my interest in this idea that bodily processes like the immune system could be used to alter brain function, I began to notice that some of the things I was studying have been around for a long time. And we've come to call them ancient practices. I sometimes call them ancient practices and associations. So, for instance, we've been talking all this stuff about microbes, about bugs. Well, we're talking about ancient associations that have been ruptured, right? So humans function best, we think, if they're back in dialogue with, back in relationship with the microbial world. Not in the ways before. We don't want to be dying by the age of 15, but we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. There's a bunch of good guy bacteria that we want to get back in relationship with. That's the ancient associations. Hyperthermia, whole body, this is heating people, right? So heat, real high heat. Hyperthermia is a paradigmatic example of an ancient practice, right? So think about all the cultures in the world that use some sort of heat application as a therapeutic modality. So in the New World, things like sweat lodges, temescals, they were ubiquitous. There were a huge number of groups used. They would, why would somebody voluntarily subject themselves, to the stifling heat of a sweat lodge? You see it across the ancient world. I mean, heat was used widely for medicinal purposes in the ancient world. I'm fascinated by this phenomenon of hot yoga, right? Why, in God's name, when you could go do yoga on a nice sunny day out on the lawn, why would you voluntarily lock yourself up in a stinky, miserably hot room, right? Well, there's an answer for this. And the answer is the reason that people didn't do sweat lodges to party back in indigenous times, the reason they use sweat lodges for healing, for stress resilience, for the induction of these sort of elevated emotional states is because heat does that. Heat is another example of a peripheral sensory process that can be harnessed to change how the brain functions. It's a kind of deep brain stimulator. And so we realized back a number of years ago that heat might have antidepressant properties. How did we realize it? Well, my friend and colleague, Christopher Lowry, who had done the experiments with Mycobacterium vaccae, that ancient bacteria, realized that heat should have the same signaling effect on the brain as that bacteria. So we set out to test it, and we've just recently published this paper. He took rodents, and half of them he heated up, hyperthermia, half of them he didn't, and then he gave them a standard antidepressant test for animals that they used to identify new antidepressant therapies. And heat worked just like an antidepressant. So around the same time, we had the opportunity to do a small study in depressed humans in Europe. We did. And we saw that if you just put them in a fancy box that has these big heating lights, and you heat them up for an hour, hour and a half, you get your body temperature up to 38.5 centigrade, which is hot. It's 101 or something. If you do that, people feel better very rapidly, and they seem to feel better for a week or two afterwards. I mean, it looked like an antidepressant. So when we were at the University of Arizona, we did a much better randomized study where we looked and we took people and we got a fancy hyperthermia machine, and we gave half the people the real heat, and we gave half the people, we put them in the same machine, and we had fake lights and fake sounds. We warmed them up a little bit so they thought they were getting something. The vast majority of them thought they'd gotten the real treatment. We looked at real hypothermia versus that sham fake treatment. And hypothermia had a profound antidepressant effect, big antidepressant effect. It was immediate, and it lasted for 6 weeks. We realized, and we think we've realized, that in fact, here's another example of, it's two things. It's a peripheral sensory pathway. We think, in fact, that heat activates immune and neural processes in the body that then go up and talk to the brain. It's also an ancient practice. It's been used all over the world repeatedly. Now we think we know why, because it changes how the brain functions. We haven't done neuroimaging studies yet, but one of the things we have done is look at what hyperthermia, you take people, you heat them, what does it acutely do to the immune system? And what it does is, interestingly, it activates the immune system in a way that really looks identical to what exercise does. And in our first study, we've seen that the more it does that, the more undepressed people get. So for everybody that goes in and gets hypothermia, the more you have that certain type of immune response, the more undepressed you're going to be 1 week later, 2 weeks later. it's a pretty big effect, actually. So we know that there's something about the immune system that is at least related to whatever heat hyperthermia is doing in the body and brain to make people feel so much better.
Now, I'm getting a little confused between hypo and hyper.
Right.
In the case of mania, hypomania means a little bit of mania.
Right.
Hypermania means a lot of mania.
Yes, exactly. So with thermia, yes, hyperthermia means heat. Hotter. Hyperthermia means that you're in an environment that is hotter than your body wants to be. Hyperthermia is going to make you sweat. Hypo with an O, thermia means that you're in an environment that's colder than your body wants to be. And so your body
did I misread it in your book? I thought the word was hypothermia.
No, hyper. It's hyper. It's
okay.
ER.
That's why.
Yeah.
It's way
now,
off.
hypothermia is also very interesting, right? And it's never been rigorously studied, but there's a craze now to take people with things like autoimmune conditions or pain disorders and stick them briefly in liquid nitrogen, which is, a couple hundred degrees below zero. A colleague of mine who's got rheumatoid arthritis did it, and it seems to be quite effective. People report feeling less anxious and less depressed, and so it may be that hypo with an O, thermia, may also have therapeutic potential. And some of the most, this is not in the book, but some of the most esoteric Tibetan Buddhist practices in the world really try to harness hypo with an O, thermia, to change brain function. It's a complex thing, but it's very interesting. So we've spent the last few years studying hyper because it just fate led us that direction. But infinite money and time, there's something interesting with cold as well as heat.
Now I have to ask you about shock therapy, because shock therapy,
ECT, electroconvulsive therapy.
That was, I think it's out of favor now, but it worked dramatically for some people.
Oh,
why?
It's still in favor. Oh, no.
Okay.
In fact, it's more in favor. It is by far the most effective treatment for depression. We all wander around, those of us who are a smidge older kind of wander around in a one flew over the cuckoo's nest world. And back in the day, back in the 40s and 50s and into the 30s, they gave ECT without anesthesia. So, they'd come up and have a seizure. And I knew patients that had remembered that and were terrified of it. Nowadays, you put people to sleep. It's safe. It's benign. It has some side effects with memory, but it's way more effective than any other treatment that we know of. The problem is it's not always long lasting, but it is rapid. I've seen many people over the years that were so depressed they literally couldn't move, they couldn't speak. After a single treatment, they would be walking around. Now, they often relapse, but by the time a week was up and they'd had multiple treatments, oh my God, it's just amazing. And there's certain types of very severe bipolar and depressive symptoms that are life-threatening. We call them lethal catatonia, that ECT is the absolute, really mandated treatment for. So nobody knows how it works. That's the funny thing. If you made a list of everything that antidepressants of all sorts seem to do, and if you ask from that list, does ECT do it? The answer is almost always yes. It just does all sorts of stuff. It's not a subtle treatment. It's like a bomb. It seems to shake everything at once.
It sounds like it's a reset button in a way.
Yeah. We think it's a reset button, right? And it's interesting. It's an unconscious reset button because people are asleep when they get it. It's not like they have an experience that's transformative. I'm involved with some work now with agents that we think operate by changing people, giving people a certain type of experience. But what's interesting about ECT is that it's unconscious. You're out, but you wake up and you don't know why. You just feel better.
Yeah. Wow. And ketamine infusion is something that I've become aware of that supposedly had good results for depression, among other things.
Absolutely.
And transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Yes. Yes and yes. Transcranial magnetic stimulation has been around for a while. It's different than ECT. You apply a magnet to the head, usually on this side, left anterior frontal cortex, and it sends a little jolt. The magnets send a little bit of electricity that goes about this far into your brain. You don't have a seizure, but the idea is that you're stimulating that part of the brain that's kind of not working so well in depression. We've gotten better at it as the years have passed. So recent studies where they really now have ways of trying to zero in on the spot that you want to put the magnet on, results are pretty good, and they're pretty good in people that have failed antidepressants. So if you have, if you are depressed and if you have not tried TMS, your list is too short. I now believe that if you are depressed and you haven't tried ketamine, your list is too short. The data that it produces a rapid antidepressant response in people that have failed everything. Not everybody, but a large percentage of people. Those data are very strong. A single dose on average makes people feel better for a week. So it's going to see, if it gets approval from the FDA, it'll see light of day as a repeated treatment. We don't have great data on, giving yourself ketamine once or twice a week over extended periods, but we do have very great data that being really catastrophically depressed is a killer. So ketamine is showing a great deal of promise. It's very interesting. We thought we knew how it worked, and now we're not so sure. Something that I am much involved with in terms of part of my research work is looking at the potential for other agents that alter consciousness as means of antidepressants, things like psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, or
yeah, I'm very
MDMA.
interested in that whole area as
right.
well.
So I serve as director of research for folks that we're working to try to really show that this might be FDA approvable. Very, very interesting treatments. There's some early studies. They're small. There's a couple of them. The results are somewhere between dramatic and jaw-droppingly dramatic. And what's really interesting is it looks like it has to do with giving people certain types of experiences, conscious experiences that change how they look at the world.
Yeah. So this raises maybe one more little area of inquiry here. What about psychotherapy? Is there, you had mentioned CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes.
Is that it in terms of the quotes best approach for depression, or
no?
Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh yeah. So there are a number of treatments that have been shown in good studies to be generally as effective as antidepressants. CBT has been the most studied. I'm very interested in something called MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. It mixes the methods of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, with the methods of mindfulness. And it's been shown to be maybe especially interesting for folks that have struggled with recurrent depression, useful in keeping them from having a relapse. There's dialectical behavioral therapy for folks that have more personality issues. There's something really interesting I think it's called rumination-focused therapy. It's come out of Europe, but it's a type of CBT but it focuses on challenging your negative ruminative thoughts. And in folks that have ruminations, it looks to be very promising. So there are a number of interesting therapeutic options that are emerging, and many of which now are beginning to have data. One of the most interesting studies, there's a couple of these studies that I think in the literature of depression are findings that if you take people who are depressed and you give them either an antidepressant or psychotherapy, you let them get well, and then you take away whatever they were on. You get rid of the antidepressant, you get rid of the psychotherapy. The people that get the antidepressant, a huge number of them relapse. They get depressed again and do so fairly quickly. The people that got to psychotherapy are much less likely to get depressed. In fact, even without the psychotherapy being ongoing, they are about as protected as people who stayed on their medicine. So one of the really interesting advantages of psychotherapy, of course, and it's a social practice, it's a conscious practice. One of its apparent advantages is that it seems to induce resilience that our pharmacologic agents do not seem to do. So it's a very, very, it's not a new modality, but it's very promising.
Wow. What a fascinating person you are to talk to, I must say.
Well, great questions. I'm not always as fascinating. I mean, you asked exactly the right questions.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I think probably we should wrap it up here. So Dr. Charles Raison, thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
This was a blast. Thanks for having me.